Hey, it's Meredith. Last week, I was at the Christian Music Broadcasters Conference in Orlando, Florida. Just a few years ago, The Unfolding was honored there with the very first Podcast of the Year award. It was such an incredible honor. Well, this year, our sister podcast, Wow God Stories, took home that same award. It was so much fun to see the creators, Jason Rackow, our producer and network director, and Michael Shermack. They were recognized for their hard work. So big congratulations to Jason and Michael and Wow God Stories. There were a lot of great speakers at that conference, but one session stood out, not just for me, but for a lot of people that I talked to. It was from Kevin Burgess, better known as KB. He spoke about the danger of making success our highest goal instead of pursuing Jesus first. There was one line that really stuck with me. He said, "Until we value what only God can produce, we'll only produce what will perish." It reminded me of the conversation that I had with Kevin just a couple of years ago. I've learned when Kevin speaks, I want to listen. So today, enjoy this powerful episode from the archives with KB. Page 166 of The Unfolding is the story of Kevin Burgess.
My situation got extremely dark. That's when I started trying things I never thought I would try, doing things I never thought I would do, trying to feel through the darkness to find some kind of answer. It was in that space somebody gave me a Christian hip-hop CD.
God's story has been unfolding
since the beginning of time.
He invites you to be a part of it.
Another page in the unfolding.
Hi, this is Meredith Foster. Kevin Burgess was like many kids growing up on the south side of St. Petersburg, Florida. Depressed, hopeless. After his parents' divorce, he'd moved from a place of relative safety to a community where drugs and violence seemed to rule, where young men don't expect to grow old. He spent his days trying to figure out how to keep himself and his family safe, and he felt forgotten by society. That's when an acquaintance handed him a Christian hip-hop CD. It was a genre of hip-hop Kevin didn't even know existed. And by the time he finished listening, his life was completely changed. Kevin Burgess is better known by his stage name, KB, and today he is a Christian hip-hop artist, music executive, author, and a man with a heart to shepherd the lost and hurting to the same hope in Jesus that he's found.
I am from Southside St. Petersburg. I was born there. I didn't spend a lot of time that I remember in St. Pete as a kid, but I do remember my mother marrying a gentleman who she was married to for 2 years. I thought that he was my father, my biological father. In fact, I had cousins that would say that we kind of looked alike, so I just assumed that that was the case. He was abusive to my mother that ended up turning into a divorce. I can recall one particular incident where I remember it being chaos in the house. I couldn't tell you what happened, who did what, who said what, but in my 3-4-year-old heart and mind, it was clear to me that I was living in a kind of dysfunction. I felt it. There was a split. My mother, not too long after that, my mom is a godly, prayer-focused, biblical scholar kind of woman and really believed that I needed to have a father figure in my life. Her father had just died, so my grandfather wouldn't be there. And I think in a lot of ways, it was a part of what she saw as her calling was to make sure that I grew up with a strong male role model in the household. So my mother remarried, and she married a military man. He was, for all intents and purposes, a good dude. He was a good father. I did not feel taken advantage of by him. I felt protected by him. He served in the Air Force. We moved from St. Pete to Southern Illinois. I spent a good chunk of my childhood on Scott Air Force Base, right outside of East St. Louis. Spent a lot of time in St. Louis. In fact, there was a time where I kind of felt like I was from St. Louis because that's where a lot of my friends were. That's where I went to church at. While I was there, my mother continued the legacy that I saw her when I was younger. She continued to pray, continued to read her Bible. When I would get in trouble, let's say if I got caught lying, my mother would make me take out a concordance and write down every single verse in the entire Bible that has the word lie in it.
Wow.
Maybe that's how I became a writer. So that's kind of how my we grew up around church. I definitely, I think earlier on, I wouldn't consider myself of growing up in the church, but certainly when we were in Illinois, we were in the church a lot. And I watched my mother really, live out the things that she believed. I don't know if it's because the Bible was often used as punishment for me, or I don't know how much that was. And well, I'm sure it was that, but even more than that, I personally just was not interested in God. I just didn't see the connection between what was happening at church and what was going on in my real life. I struggled as a young man, as a young boy, rather. I had deep, deep sensitivity to what was going on in my heart emotionally. I felt these aches and pains in my soul that I couldn't put words to, but I was carrying them around. And it didn't feel like God was doing much for that. But it was very clear to me that God would do certain things in our lives. My father, who was in the Air Force, that's the father that adopted me, whose last name I have. He was very near to alcoholic at one point. Didn't affect how he treated me, but I saw him go through a kind of conversion where he didn't go through a 12-step program. He just gave his life to Jesus, and I saw him not drinking anymore. And I saw what he was listening to not being the same. He was leading us in prayer. I saw, oh man, this God does do things in people. I saw that. I also, when I was a young man on Scott Air Force Base, I was riding my bike home from the pool. A car came out of nowhere and hit me. And I had my helmet on, but it wasn't strapped. And I remember distinctly that helmet would fall off my head all the time because I never strapped it. Somehow I was able to flip over my bike, my head go through their windshield, my back land squarely on the hood, go flying off of their car, bouncing on the ground, scraping up my back, and the helmet stayed on the whole time.
Oh my goodness.
And by God's grace, the helmet saved my life or saved me from being paralyzed. Simultaneously, when I got to the hospital, the doctors were looking at me wondering how I was walking because a boy, he had to be the same age as or close to the same age that I was, on the other side of the base, was also being rushed to the hospital, who was also hit by a car, but he looked like he wasn't going to make it. So the doctors thought that I was the other boy, but it seems like I was spared.
Wow.
Because I had a similar situation. I knew that God was preserving me. Even before I knew him, I didn't know his face, but I knew his hand. I was like, there's God in this. I didn't know his heart, but I knew his hand. I'll put it like that. So the time that I lived on base, I did get to see my father, who was a soldier in the military. He taught me about hard work, discipline, chivalry, some aspects of character and integrity. But unfortunately, some of those things that he gave himself to earlier kind of dissipated. It led into my parents' divorce, and my mother and I moved back to St. Pete, smack dab in the middle of the hood. That was a dramatic shift in environment. Wow. I went from a structured, safe, I never saw crimes being committed. The worst crime I saw was a high schooler smoking a cigarette. And I remember being shook by that. Like, this dude is wild. He's smoking a cigarette and he's 14. But then when I got, if you're living in poverty, and this is all over the world, for those who get so desperate in their poverty, they will do anything to try to feed their families. And also, we don't realize that when you are outside of poverty, you have access to certain resources that keep your family safe that you would not have if you were living in an impoverished area. So you have to think through other ways, other alliances, other partnerships to keep your family safe that you might not even think about on the other side of town. And you don't have a lot of recourse outside of what you and your family and friends and allegiances and alliances can kind of put together. It's a difficult place to grow up. And I remember walking to the bus stop feeling, I distinctly remember one morning going to the bus stop, walking over, it was early in the morning. We lived far from the school as well. We had to get bussed into the other side of town. So we got to be up at 5 to get on the bus to make it to school on time. And I remember one morning walking in the dark to the bus stop, stepping over a bag that had a controlled substance in it. And even in that little place, before I really gave my life to Jesus, just in this weird moment of me stepping over a bag of drugs, I thought, children should not be growing up like this. I shouldn't be stepping over this. This is not the way things should be. That story continued for me. This is not the way things should be. I should not be this depressed. I should not feel so forgotten by the rest of society. I shouldn't feel so trapped. I should not feel so confused. I should not have to be a man at 15 years old and be the one thinking about how I'm going to keep my mother safe in a neighborhood I just got to. These things should not be happening. What has gone wrong that has caused this? And as I was living out the ills of what should not be, it was in that space that my situation got extremely dark. And that's when I started trying things I never thought I would try, doing things I never thought I would do, trying to feel through the darkness to find some kind of answer in this confusion.
How old were you when you moved to St. Pete? What age were you? And then you said you felt aches and pains in your soul. You didn't know how to identify those. And I'm just curious if as an adult you reflect back, if you can flesh out what was going on, those two things.
Great question. So I want to say that we moved back to St. Pete around 12 or 13. I was like 12 or 13 years old, I think. And the aches in my soul. So what it means, what I understand theologically for me to be made in the image of God, when Moses says in Genesis 1:26-27, in the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. The most basic, the most essential aspect of who I am is that I am a image bearer, which is a powerful thing to have the God of the universe to make you after his image. But what we understand through reading Genesis and also understanding how people thought about the image of a God in the ancient Near East is that the image of God, it speaks to character traits. So like how images are, some folks were saying that they saw some aliens in their backyard a few days ago. If when the police come to the scene, they say, hey, what were the characteristics of these beings you saw in your backyard? So then they begin to describe it. Well, he looked like this. They kind of moved like this. Their faces look like that. They're the characteristics of their image. That is a very important aspect of the image of God, that we have been made in the image of God so that we are designed to share his characteristics. God is like kindness. God is like love. God is forgiving. These are the characters. This is what he looks like. But also the image of God is also a function. God does things as well. The way that God creates things. So we are to go out in the world and create things, cultivate things, be fruitful, to multiply. God sacrifices. So we are to sacrifice for other people. It's the function. And every human being is trying to figure out how do they particularly live out the function of the image of God that is on their souls. What I was doing is that I realized that I was made to be something and to do something. And as I'm sitting here, especially as a teenager, which I would argue is the most important years for you to be crystal clear about what you are called to be and what it is that at least have an idea of what it is God will have you doing in this world. Because I only had the reference of people who were around me, which is also how God intended it. God intended for the image of God to exist in community, right? So as I'm in a community, then I'm thinking about who are the strong people around me? Who are the wise people around me? Who are the resource people around me? And you mix that with youthful ignorance that discern to answer those questions typically in immature ways, because I was surrounded by there were strong people around me. In fact, in every I would argue in most concentrated poverty areas, like any neighborhood, anywhere, you're going to have people who are, for the most part, there, who are contributing to society, who are important to the fabric of our community. And then you have a small minority of people who are terrorizing the rest of us. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, in concentrated poverty areas, when you're in the hood, that small minority is projected as the majority through media. And everyone in that neighborhood, everyone in that environment gets looked down upon because of the perpetuation of a stereotype. But young people, young artists, and the media are really good at taking what should be rejected in our community and projecting it as the sum and substance of our community. And I was a victim to that. And so I'm looking at rappers. These are people that came from where I came from. They seem to have gotten money, power, and respect, which it seems like what life is about. There was a drug dealer in my family who was always able to help. If there was a bill that needed to be paid, if there was someone that got in some kind of financial bind with their home or their mortgage, or if someone needed to get freed from some financial chain, and financial chains are heavy, it was the drug dealer in my neighborhood, in my family, that would show up and help us. So I'm thinking, maybe I should be like him. What is he like? What are the things that he's in? So I'm asking questions. Anyways, to answer your question, as I am looking at I'm looking at all these examples and then trying to reflect what they're doing in my search to find my purpose, my function as an image bearer. I was trying to imitate them, and it hurt me all the more. And I'll give you two quick examples. One, I thought what it meant to be a man is that you're willing to fight at all times. You're always willing to fight. I'm 34 years old now, and I actually am a fighter. So I box regularly. In fact, I sparred this morning for my workout. I love the art and science of boxing. You realize, though, when you go to punch somebody in the face, when you're in the context of just taking your fists and punching someone, another image bearer, in the face to hurt them, there's no telling what might come out of that. You could break their jaw. You could cause internal bleeding. There's something really, really profoundly sacred about hitting somebody in the face. And the context where you would need to do something like that should be seen as a heavy, heavy reality. And I thought what it meant is to be willing to hurt somebody, even kill somebody, based off them looking at me wrong.
Wow.
Or stepping on my shoe, or talking too much on the basketball court, or not wearing not being on the wrong block at the wrong time. I thought that was manhood. And as I tried to approximate that, being 105 pounds, soaking wet with Timberland boots on, and had no idea how to fight, trying to live in this where violence is a part of how we communicate, that injures you. It makes it hard for you to integrate into the workspace, or it makes it difficult for you to, for example, be in an organized basketball club because, one of your teammates or your coach said something. It does not build a character of overlooking offense. It develops a bad character trait of being a overreactor and someone that does not have a lot of control of their emotions. Anyway, that's one example. The second example is what I thought it meant to be a man was somebody who would pursue as many women as they could and to have as many sexual exploits as they could. When we're talking about areas of concentrated poverty where there is not there are at least a small group of individuals in there that see no future, there's no way out of this. And many of us, this wouldn't be a small minority. Many of us feel this weight where we feel trapped by poverty, and that there's nothing else more for me in this world than where I am right now and what has always been here. That's where my parents were. That's where their parents were. We are stuck. And if you have people who feel stuck, who are not dreaming, who are not hoping, that don't see a future, you begin to reenact the principle that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15 to tell Christians why it is so important to focus on, to defend, and to believe in the resurrection. Because if there is no resurrection, if the resurrection already happened, then Christianity is in vain, that there is no future for us. There is no hope of glory. All there is what is. So eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But if there is a future for us, it brings all of the purpose and all of the energy and life that we need to live in the present moment. And that's a principle that we see played out. And what I'm saying, if you lose that, if you I don't have a future, I don't have a hope. When I was living in that environment, many of us don't see ourselves 30 and 40 years old. I know I didn't. I didn't see myself being an old man. I didn't think I would make it past 21, 22 years old. Because of the lack of there's nothing else, you really turn in on yourself, and you can find yourself, at least for the young boys, indulging in this is just something that I experienced while I was there, that fed this desire to turn on myself and then just pursue the pleasures of the flesh, because that's what it seems like those who are in power, loved and respected, they do that. They get plenty of that. So I'm going to give myself to that. And as we know, as sin is faithful to always disappoint, to always destroy, sin is always faithful to devastate. And that is what happened for me. It was in that space that somebody gave me a Christian hip hop CD.
Kevin felt hopeless, depressed, like there was no way out of his circumstance. But God would use music and the art of rap to show Kevin there was another way. In your time when you were at Scott Air Force Base, your mom was, her relationship or her pursuit of Jesus, reading the Bible, praying. What did faith look like? Now you're in this situation, which feels just desperate. I'm going to assume it was probably that way for your mom as well. Was faith a part of that season as well?
It was still present in my mom, but I still saw it as her faith. I never saw what she was committed to as a means by which I would process my own pain and suffering. So it was there, but for me, it was like one of those things where your children don't really appreciate certain things about what you do for them until they have children themselves, where I felt like I couldn't appreciate that my mom was praying for me and that my mom was an example of godliness until I realized how I needed prayer and I needed examples of godliness. And I didn't really see that until I had that encounter with that gentleman at school that gave me a Christian hip hop CD.
Yeah, tell me that story, because that's a watershed moment in your life.
Yes, absolutely. So I was, junior in high school, and I heard there was a dude that was in my school that was a rapper, and I saw him one day after class, and I asked him, I said, hey, do you want to battle rap sometime? And he said to me, I don't battle rap, I do Christian rap. And I remember almost like wincing, like, what do you mean you do Christian rap? What is that? But then another emotion came in where I was like, man, this dude just told me without qualification that he was committed to the things of God, and he's not worried about how I looked at him. He's not worried about how I felt about his religious commitment. And I was struck by how he was unashamed. And I saw Jeremy, that was his name, Jeremy Baker. I saw him sometime later outside eating lunch. I walked over to the table and he had a CD on the table, and the CD had a dude on the front cover that had dreadlocks, red bandana going across his mouth, red bandana going across his forehead. And the title of the album was Bloody Streets Volume 1. And Jeremy told me that it was Christian music, and which was hard for me to believe to some degree. And so I took it home and I listened to it. I loved every single song. It sounded like the music that I liked listening to. He was telling his story of how God had radically saved him and changed him, and how he was essentially, before Jesus, he represented the destination of what I thought manhood was before he came to Jesus. He had money, power, he had respect, he had a harem of women. He, in a lot of ways, embodied all of the toxicity and, unbiblical forms of masculine pursuits, which I thought was the right way. He was everything I wanted to be. But he showed me that on the other side is destruction. In the midst of his pursuits of the flesh was disaster. And long story short, Jesus snatched him up. He went through a radical transformation, and his name in the streets used to be Sinister. He was aptly sort of carrying the language of the demonic as a non-believer. The Lord saved him. He dropped the S on his name and turned it to Minister. Oh, it spelt it Mynista. And that's what, and to this day, he's actually a pastor in Philly right now. To his day, that's who he is. He gave his life to the ministry of the gospel. And on that album, in the last song, he had a gospel presentation, and I believed on Jesus, and that marked the beginning of my journey with him.
Wow. So what did that look like? I know for some people it's a radical overnight transformation. You are in an environment where there are not a lot of people, or that you're apparently not aware of a lot of people who would necessarily be supportive of that outside of your mom. So what did that look like as that transformation began?
It started very much alone. So outside of Jeremy, and I only saw Jeremy at school, I didn't have people around me that were walking with the Lord. So my mom, my grandmother, I had folks around me who were serious about Jesus. I had an uncle that had a radical transformation too. I became more interested in listening to them and reading what they were reading, and sort of discovering God, what it felt like for the first time. But I did it largely with few people my age, with few peers. And I still had some of my friends. I had a high school sweetheart. I started talking to her about Jesus a lot. as I started to get serious about the Lord. So I was talking to her a good bit about it. But outside of that, I was the only one that was like leaning into this. So I started to read as much as I could. I started walking around the concordance that I hated. I used to walk around with it because if I didn't understand something, I would open the concordance and find the word in the Hebrew or the Greek. I just started drinking down the word as much as I could. And I would try to go. There was a youth group that was at a church that was in my neighborhood. Started going around there, but it was a similar thing. It wasn't like I was judging anybody or anything like that, but I really was the only person that was like really trying to live this out. Everyone else was church's culture as opposed to conviction. So it was lonely at first, but I didn't feel alone at all. I felt like there was many with me. And the truth is that there was. God was with me and the resource of heaven was behind me. I did not feel lonely at all. Shortly, I probably was a year in, I started a job at a grocery store that just was actually pretty promising. It was the first grocery store that I could think of that was built in what was ostensibly a food desert, which was our neighborhood. And they were hiring folks in the neighborhood. It was a beautiful thing. I went and interviewed for a job there. I got the job, and in orientation, I met a gentleman who shared many interests that I had. I've always been into sneakers and into fashion and in hip hop. I met a dude there, and he and I started talking, and it began with him noticing I was wearing these special edition Jordans. They were the 20th anniversary. They're called the Dub Zeros, and he knew about the Dub Zeros have a lot of detail in them. So we kind of were talking about that. And I had recently been saved, but I was trying to tell as many people about Jesus as I could. So I started talking to him about the Lord. And to make a long story short, by God's grace, I was, I led him to the Lord. I gave him that CD that I had, and then he became my first disciple. And I started pouring into him, and we started doing life together. We became best friends. I was 17. He was 16 at the time. And here we are 15 years later, still best friends. And we do a podcast together called Southside Rabbi.
Oh, how cool. I didn't realize that's who that was.
I mean the dream. Uh-huh.
Wow. So I think it's fascinating. I mean, it speaks to some of the way that God created you and knit you together, like to have the fortitude. Not everybody would do that. Sometimes the seed falls on rocky path and you might receive it, but being immersed in a place, as you said, you were basically, starting this faith journey alone in a lot of ways. And yet sometimes there's just being desperate enough is the thing that fuels us. And I don't know if that's what you attribute that to, as you look back on why you weren't one of those people that, sort of just that faith fell to the wayside.
I think that a lot of it has to do that there were some things that I got early that would probably be described by some folks who are later in life. They would say, man, I wish that somebody would have told me about this sooner. Like those category of things that you're like, man, I wish somebody would have told me about this sooner. Mm-hmm. I have some things like that in my life, but I have a lot of things in my life that someone told me about sooner. So I didn't have to go out and get, ran over by a train to figure out how I should act on tracks. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So one of those things, I'll give you two. Two of those things, I'll give you the first one. The first one is I knew early on, even though I didn't have a bunch of believers around me at first, it became clear to me, and it's a much longer story, because after I became a Christian, I was a part of a program that allowed me, it's called Upward Bound. If you finish the program, it's a government-funded program for inner-city kids with a high enough GPA. If you go through this program, they pay for your college. And I was in that program, and the program lets you live the college. You can live for 2 summers in high school. You would go live on a college campus, and you would, for 6 weeks, basically live the college life. And the college life has a lot of stuff involved in it. And I learned the first year I did it, I was not a believer. The second year I went to do the program, I was a believer, and it was a disaster. And I ended up having to I had trouble with the program to put me being in the program in jeopardy. I was accepted back in the program, and I had to call the president and say, sir, nothing means more important to me than my faith. And I don't know how to be a part of this program and keep myself in check. I feel like it's too soon for me. And so I need my faith to kind of finish cooking before I jump into a college for real. So he was upset with me. Like, we made all these adjustments for you to be here, and you're supposed to be this Christian guy, and you're not doing what you said. I was like, I hear you. You're right. But the good news is, and it's a whole other story, I was already in college because of another program that I was in that allowed me to start college while I was in high school. So I was okay in terms of getting my college paid for, but I knew that I could not do this program. Because of that, those kinds of experiences, I realized that I needed to be around Christians a lot, like especially in these early years. And I needed in my life. I needed to be seeing them. I needed to be teaching the Bible. I needed to be doing ministry as a means to grow. I learned that early, and God just one by one just started sending me people.
Wow.
Until there was an entire movement by the time I was in my early 20s of young men and women that loved Jesus and were doing great work in the city. And the second thing that I learned early, that I'm glad somebody taught me early, was that young people, young marriages, young Christians should do their best to also be around older Christians. So ask them how they did it. How did they survive? So I was constantly being discipled by trustworthy pastors and mentors. I would say, I think it's probably here recently that I've kind of stood up more as my own man. But for most of my life, I've given myself to the counsel of my pastors and my mentors, my spiritual leaders. I am friends with all of them to this day and grateful for their presence in my life as I try to be that for other people now. So I could say other things, but those two things, absolutely. I saw the importance of community very, very young. And then I also saw the importance of trusting the counsel of the wise and the godly and those who are more mature than I am, and staying around them, letting them pour into me, letting them correct me, asking them questions, getting them involved, riding their coattail till they say, get off. And I think those two things has helped me to stay.
Wow. Amazing that you had the awareness to realize you weren't ready. As you said, you had to cook a little longer in your faith than you needed just to have that recognition. That's a gift from God that you knew that and had that conviction followed through on it. At what point, I knew you were interested in hip hop and, you're talking about college. When did that sort of occur to you that might be a part of your life and your ministry? Was there like a calling? How did that even come about? And was that a big part of your spiritual growth?
Yeah, it was a part of my spiritual growth because it was like what David had the Psalms. We had Christian hip hop where here we are, we have this outlet in which we're able to write about what we're feeling, what we're thinking, and what we long to see in the world. That journaling, that songwriting, God also likes songs. I think we forget about that. That Yahweh is a God of songs. He wants us to sing songs. He wants us to memorize songs. He wants us to write new songs. He wants to greet each other. That's what Paul says, to greet each other with songs and spiritual songs and hymns. There's something happening in the world of music and spirituality that is undeniable for the Christian. So I do see the writing of songs and putting them out, sharing with other people, encouraging other people with them as a spiritual discipline that is good for the creative. So I was doing that. It wasn't like there was a ton of Christian hip hop, and there were certain things that I wished that existed, and I started to make that. And I also saw it as an effective way to share my faith. So I was very interested in evangelizing. So I would also make music to share my faith. But then lastly, I was affirmed by people around me that I actually had a gift at it, that I was actually good at it. And I never thought about making a career out of it. I had a lot of good things going on with the academic world. There was really no need for me, not no need, but there was no desire for me to be a rapper. But the more I rapped, the more people wanted to hear it. And then there was tremendous fruit. I'll tell you this last story where this was kind of one of the moments where I was like, oh, shoot, maybe I'm supposed to be doing this. I think I was 17. They had a competition in Gainesville, Florida, called Battle of the Bands. And a friend of mine was like, hey, I'm going up there. You want to come with me? I'm going to compete in this little competition. We can do stuff together. I was like, sure, I'll go see if my mom was cool with it. So I went with him, and on the ride up there, we played some beats in the car. It was like a CD with beats on it. And we kind of made some songs up on the way up there. And then we got up there. It was like a legit competition. Like it was like band with banners and trailers. I remember one of the guys that went before us, he was playing the guitar behind his back. Like it was on his neck. And he was like, had his head down. And so we were like, oh, we're definitely losing this. We just got a CD with beats on it. And then the judges it's like a 3-hour thing, and the judges has been watching this thing forever. And so we were last. So the judges were going to be tired. There was no way we were going to win. Anyways, it was our turn to get up. We went on, we gave them the beat. It was it wasn't organized. Like, hey, can you play track 3? Then after 3, can you play 5? And then they started playing 6. Like, no, go back to 5. It was very unorganized. It was not well done. But when we started rapping, God stepped down. And something that I cannot even make that much sense of today happened as we were performing, that it gripped the hearts of the people that were there. The judges were moved. At one point in the set, I remember, I don't know if I asked people if they needed prayer. No, somebody came to the front of the stage and was like, will you pray for me? And I jumped off the stage and prayed for them. And then got back on the stage and started doing music again. And it was mostly freestyles and repeating the lyrics of other artists. It was nothing, you know what I'm saying? It wasn't, it was nothing in the performance, but God did something powerful that was undeniable. And it was so undeniable that the judges gave us the entire competition. So we got $800. Yep. We made $800 or $600, something like that, and took home the trophy. We got the number 1 spot. And that was the most money I'd ever made in my life. And it was all 20s. So I had like this big stack of cash. And I was like, I remember I went to work and showed at Sweet Bay in the parking lot, bro, look at all of this money that we just made. I don't know how it happened, but that got me thinking, because I knew that wasn't me. There was something else happening there that made me say, okay, maybe God is going to do something special when I open my mouth and start reciting things. As I started to do it more and more demand. So people started putting it on YouTube. I didn't even have a YouTube, and people were posting what we were doing on YouTube. And all of a sudden, Reach Records got a hold of it, and they became very interested in what was happening in Tampa. And long story short, it ended in a record deal for me.
Incredible. Having those kind of encounters, that's the way I describe that. I pray that for my kids. I've got teenagers, and it's one of the things I pray for, is that they would have that kind of encounter with God, because number one, it's like that affirmation, oh, he's real and he cares about me. And maybe there is a particular purpose, a way that he's wired me. Because when he does that kind of stuff, you know it's him, it's not you. How incredible.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I would love to talk just real briefly. I know we've only got a couple minutes left, but I would love to just talk a little bit about, because you've written a book. So you've released music, and that's been powerful. But I would love to just talk about where that came from, what made you decide to do that. If you could talk about Dangerous Jesus, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. So I think I'm an artist for sure, but I think more than anything, I'm a friend that has shepherding qualities, that has a shepherding bent. I want to be a friend to people, and I want to help them walk through their lives, through their issues, their wounds, in a way that strengthens God's church. I think that's just my leaning. There's only so much one can do in a 3 or 4 minute song. And I, like many of us, am seriously concerned about the North American church, who I love dearly. And I realize that God has equipped me with some perspective, with some abilities, and with an opportunity to be a part of the kind of pantheon or the library of works, and not just books, podcasts, songs, movies, just all these ways in which God is using folks like me to influence a Christianity that is in crisis. And I wrote this book as another offering to help navigate these tricky waters of grave confusion, grave hypocrisy. I think there's some compromise in there. There's the church as it stands is losing tremendous effect on the newer generation. And I think in a lot of ways, for millennials, they are also growing weary as deconversion and deconstruction movements run wild. So within my gifts, my calling and my ability, I have this burden to help us, to help lead us, to serve us. And that's what I wanted to do with the book. Is I wanted to have an in-depth offering that is walking through hard issues like race, like justice, like allegiance to the kingdom over an empire, reminding us of what the gospel truly is, what essential Christianity is, giving us tools that we might strengthen our faith in the ways in which we talk to each other, how we enjoy our lives, how we sacrifice for others, just all these, like, I write almost as someone that's giving their final appeal. And it's like, I got to cover a bunch of different things, but I got to at least address them in a helpful way that we might experience a kind of renewal and revival. So that's where the book came from. I am a writer. I've been a writer, since high school, but I've never really gotten the opportunity to step into that space. So when Tyndale approached me, it felt like the time was right. It was right, in the pandemic, at the end of the pandemic. So I was called to write, and I wrote.
Well, I'm grateful that you've done it. I just read an article. It was talking about a Barna study recently released that was talking about the number one objection to Christianity in American culture. And hypocrisy is the top of the list, right? That's what so many people see. And so I love that you've tackled it. And I think you have a unique perspective and history that allows you to wade into that in a way and have platform to share it with people. And I'm grateful you've done it. I also think about just when I hear you talk about being a 13, 14-year-old, moving from that at least perceived, safety, security of life as it was when you were on Scott Air Force Base, and then moving into this community, which felt so desperately dangerous. I would want to rescue a kid out of that. But I think in hindsight, the fact that you've had that experience is part of the reason why you can write this book. Because
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. And so I don't know if you look back on that and see how God's hand is on even the hard in your life that's prepared you for where you are right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And let me just say this too, Meredith. What you just said was so astute, because I lived in fear when I was living in Southside St. Petersburg before Jesus. The gunshots at night, the ambulance, the police officers, just the turmoil in the community. And I remember looking at that with trepidation and terror, where I even got a kind of a reputation of being what we would call scary. Like, he's scary. And meeting Jesus, not only was I able to see how he was using the darkness of my situation as ink to write my story, also gained a new understanding, a new perspective on the neighborhood that I was living in. The fear of injury was subdued, and the thinking that, like I told you, in these communities, oftentimes there's a small minority of people that are causing problems for everybody else. Mm-hmm. They just get the most airtime on TV. Those individuals can, in some ways, become the narrative. But I was able to see all of the brilliance and all of the wonderful things to be excited about, even in a community that is under-resourced, that God was doing things and standing up families. And my father wasn't present, but there was a lot of fathers in my neighborhood. In fact, I saw more fathers present with their sons than I saw not present with their sons. And I didn't even think about it that way. I only thought about it through the statistics. And the way that I was able to look at this community, like, wait, there are ways in which the enemy would cause me to look at this place as a hellhole that I need to escape, as opposed to a place where the image of God is, where Jesus still reigns, and where God is intending to do powerful, wonderful, empowering things. That also was a result of coming to know Jesus. That is, to this day, now I have affection and love from a place that I despise, and nobody but Jesus could do something like that.
KB's book is called Dangerous Jesus, and it's also available as an audiobook narrated by KB himself. It is a powerful way to experience his story. If you want to see him live, he'll be at music festivals all across the U.S. this summer. And you can learn more about his music at whoiskb.com. Be sure to check out his podcast, too. It's called Southside Rabbi. Big thanks to KB for sharing his story, and to the amazing team behind this episode, Michael Shermack, Lindsay Caparoon, and our producer and network director, Jason Rackow. The Unfolding is a production of Faith Podcasts. You can discover more great shows at myfaithpodcasts.com. If you enjoyed this episode, take a moment to follow, rate, or leave a kind review. It really helps us share these powerful stories. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week with another page of The Unfolding.